Hello students, this is a video lecture for chapter 4 in the book Daytripper by Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba. So very briefly, as we always do, a quick refresher on the major themes we can find throughout the book Daytripper. One of the key themes we will look for is the role and importance of family, especially the role fatherhood plays as an element in Braza's life and an element in a family. This chapter, chapter 4, is particularly focused on the idea of fatherhood and engages with fatherhood as a theme throughout the chapter. Next, we will find throughout the book the role of nature and the difference between the nature and the natural life and life in a city. As always, the theme of death will be omnipresent throughout the book, especially how death and rebirth work in a cycle, and death is a part of life as opposed to something that is separate from life. And finally, the idea of truth, all right, the idea of what is true or what is important in life, and how Bras is on a journey to find and discover truth. So, as always, make sure you take time to question and write questions about things you have read. So let's start with chapter 4. Right? As you can see from the splash page that comes before the chapter, the role of fatherhood and Bras's father and Bras becoming a father are a central theme of chapter 4. Chapter 4 has two central events that drive the narrative of the chapter. One, it is Bras and Anna, the woman who we saw in the shop in the last chapter in chapter 3, also is his wife he talks to on the phone in chapter 1, are having a son. Their son will be named Miguel, and Bras's father, Benedito, dies. Some other things to note. Note that Jorge is missing during the funeral scene. Bras tells us that Jorge is not there to attend the funeral of Bras's father. Bras learns that his father has a child with a different woman, and so he has a step sibling. And finally, Bras dies in his father's study on a request from his dead father. If you remember in the story, Bras is going back to the house to get a special dressing garment for his son that was particularly selected to by his father, and the mother, Bras's mother, basically guilts Bras into going it by saying, this is something your father would have wanted, so it was almost like a last request to return back to the study, where Bras then dies at the end of the chapter. So, from the very beginning, we see that the nature of family and the role of family will be very important to this theme. We begin with a scene of family when Bras and Anna are having their first child. Once again, all right, the chapter reinforces the cyclical nature of death and rebirth. As Bras's father dies, Bras is becoming a father. Like he himself is now at the center of a cycle of death and rebirth. All right, someone dies, but someone new is born. Much like we saw in the end of chapter 2, that idea of death as a common theme and part of a larger cycle is central to the theme, an overall theme of death in the novel. Next, we learn that Bras, his father, had an affair that created a stepsister. This revelation that Bras's father was not the hero and amazing person that Bras thought him shakes Bras's entire vision of who he thought his father was. Remember how often in the previous chapters up to this chapter, Bras was struggling to live in the legacy and shadow of his father. His father is this great man who gives these wonderful lectures, who dispenses this sage advice. He is a famous novelist. He is somebody who, from all purposes and all appearances, seems to have a unique intelligence and ability and is a man of great importance. However, this realization, Bras learns that his father, whom he thought was perfect, whom he was living in the shadow, was not, in fact, perfect at all. In fact, he had an affair that led to the creation of a step-sibling for Bras. So this heightens Brass's anxiety about his own role of being a father. Because if Brass's father, this great man, this learned man, this wise man, was not perfect, how then could Brass even come close to that? This notion of who his father really was forces Brass to recontextualize his thoughts about Benedetto and also recontextualize what he believed the role of fatherhood was more generally. This pierces his vision of who his father is and forces Brass into a series of questions and anxiety. This theme of fatherhood continues when Brass learns in the chapter that he himself will have a son. The cyclical nature of life and death continues in the book as a male in the Olivia Domingo's family dies, so too a new male in that family comes in almost as if to take his place. As Brass loses a father, he becomes the father to a son. This realization, however, is one with which Brass struggles because he has now understands that his father, this famous literary thinker, was not a perfect father. So Brass is struck with ideas of how he could be any different. Will he be adequate enough when he learned that his father was not even adequate enough? The threads about Benedetto and fatherhood come together at the very end of the chapter, in which we have a highly symbolic act. All right? Remember, as we said, in the narrative of the chapter, Brass loses his father at the very moment he becomes a father. So too do we see in this scene, we have Brass entering into the father's office. He is now visually engaging in a symbolic act of becoming and entering the space of fatherhood. Brass stresses the emotional and symbolic nature of this. When he enters the father's room, he states that he feels Benedetto wasn't there and was yet everywhere. The presence of Benedetto represents the image of fatherhood. Brass states that everything in this office seemed grand because his father seemed grand. Right? His father was this amazing man. He feels like a small boy and remembers what it was like to be a small boy in this office surrounded by the gigantic image of his father. And at the end of this page, on page 103, Brass states that he wanted to become a writer so he could assure his place in his father's heart. So if you were asking yourself, what was Brass's motivation to become a writer? Brass's motivation was to assure a place in his father's heart, to assure a place in his father's world, to earn the recognition and validation of his father. Right? So we see here that the symbolic nature of the father is less about who Benedetto was as a man. We know that he was flawed as a man. He had an affair that produced a child with somebody else, and everything in the book seems to say that this would not have been kosher. There was not an open relationship. But to Brass, the symbolic nature of who his father was is way more grander and larger than who the person was as an individual. Brass's feelings about his father represent an interesting psychological concept. All right? A psychological concept we could call the name of the father. The name of the father is the impossibility of the blending of what we think of in terms of the symbolic nature of fatherhood, the images of who we think a father should be, with the actual people who are fathers. The name of the father blends together cultural, psychological, and symbolic aspects of what fatherhood is to present the notion that fathers are more than just people in parts of a family. Okay? One of the things that Brass struggles with is the fact that he feels that he could never reach the authority figure of his father, the symbolic weight of his father, because that person is so grand and so much larger than him. The scene presented to you here on page 103 on this slide, we see Brass telling us that he felt he could never be a part of his father's world because of the symbolic weight of his father. So, the role of the father as a symbol in literature is a huge one. We see father figures everywhere. We see father figures played out in terms of father figures who are bad, who are good, father figures who are biological fathers, who are not. In investigating the role of the father as a symbol in literature, Gabriel Moon and Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba are using a psychoanalytical analysis of it. They are trying to investigate how Brass, as their main character, his mind and his understanding of who his father was, represents his own anxieties and desires. His inability to think that he could earn his father's love, his inability to ever be sure that he had a place in his father's heart, is less about what the relationship between Benedito and Brass was. Instead, it's more about how Brass fears his own inability to become a father, especially what we might call a good father. So in the symbolic language of fatherhood, we can think of it as three ways. When we think of fatherhood and we think of fathers, we have three forces that work together to create a symbolic image of who our fathers are and who our fathers were and how fathers are depicted in literature. One, we have the symbolic father. This is the way society constructs and privileges the idea of what fathers are and their role in society. Next up is the imaginary father. The imaginary father is the imagined image of fathers that exists that you have, whether it's connected to your real father or not. And three, then you have the real father, the actual physical body of someone that is a parent. So let's look. So the symbolic father is the way society says what fathers are. It's the rules and regulations and cultural concepts that society puts on someone to say they are a good or bad father. Next, the imaginary father is the father symbol, the idea of the father that exists in your head. All right? Your image of your father is not entirely connected to who your actual father was. Instead, it's an amalgamation of what society has told you fathers are, with all of the images of fathers you have seen and read in culture, and then added into that is the actions and emotions and place of the actual real person, the physical body of someone who is a parent. So Brass is struggling with this on three main levels, right? One, he's having a hard time understanding what he feels a father should be. He's having a hard time understanding himself in the role of a symbolic father, having that role in society. He feels anxious about it. He feels uncertain about it. He has an inability to now square the circle of the imaginary father with the real man who existed. The imaginary father, the image of Benedito Brass has in his head, no longer matches up with what might be the real actions and person that Benedito was. In Brass's head, Benedito is this amazing, wonderful father who is perfect and smart and a literary superstar. But now he has learned that the real man, Benedito, had an affair that produced a child out of wedlock. All right? That is not the actions of the imaginary father that Brass has in his head. So all three of these concepts of the father are breaking down for Brass at the end of the chapter. He can't get an idea of fatherhood to fit symbolically in terms of the imaginary view of his own father, and then what the real actions of Benedito did. So the symbolic and imaginary weight of Brass's father and his legacy, both good and bad, his legacy as an amazing man and his legacy as someone who could have an affair and a child out of wedlock, are too much for Brass to handle. And he literally dies in the father's room while becoming a father. The symbolic weight of trying to live up to what being a father is in his mind kills him. The book says his heart stops because Benedito's death and his inability to fill in now as the position of the father for the family was too hard for Brass's own heart to handle. So he follows his father's lead and dies, leaving a wife and son. So the theme and the ending of chapter 4, Brass having a heart attack in his father's room on the day he becomes a father himself, right, underlines how the desire to live up to the symbolic and imaginary weight of fatherhood is doomed for failure. Right? You will never ever get to be a perfect fit with who you feel a father should be or what society even says a good father should do. Right? So Daytripper, as a book, argues that people should only aim for being a father and avoid trying to carry the symbolic and imaginary weight of perfect fatherhood. Right? Once again, we have a notion that there are no grand stories. There are no grand plans. There is no perfect father. There is only the best father you could be. And Brass's heart literally stops in the room of his perfect father because Brass, the anxiety of being a father, the anxiety of trying to be a perfect father is too much to handle, and Brass dies. So, chapters 4 and 5, or chapters 4, and we'll talk about chapter 5 later, the role of family is developed to present an argument that it is impossible to live up to any imaginary or symbolic roles of fatherhood. The name of the father, the sociological, cultural, and symbolic notion of what fatherhood is a weight that crushes Brass. He's too busy trying to live up to the concept of fatherhood, as opposed to just trying to be the best parent he could be. And this dichotomy is eventually what ends in chapter 4, Brass's life. So as you go, see how Brass tries to learn a lesson about what type of father he could be, regardless of whether or not it is a perfect father or represents a perfect symbolic weight of the father. In essence, see how Brass casts away the name of the father to try and chart his own path towards an understanding of fatherhood. That is the end of this video lecture. We will continue a lecture on chapter 5 in Daytripper next week.